They told him fear was weakness, but no one told him that fear can build empires if you know how to control it. This is not a story about courage. This is a story about what happens when a man refuses to let fear expose him. This is the story of a boy who learned early that the world only respects strength and forgets the weak. This is the story of Alexander the Great and the fear he never showed. Alexander was not born fearless. He was born surrounded by pressure, expectation, and impossible standards. From the moment he could understand words, he was told he was different. Because of who he was, but because of who he was expected to become. His father, King Philip of Macedon, was a warrior king who believed discipline and dominance were the only paths to survival, while his mother, Olympias, filled Alexander's mind with stories of God's destiny and divine blood. Together they created a child who did not learn how to live, but learned how to perform greatness. Alexander grew up watching power decide everything: respect, loyalty, love, and survival. He learned that hesitation invites destruction and mercy invites rebellion. This environment planted a silent fear deep inside him. The fear of being seen as ordinary. The fear of disappointing those who projected their ambitions onto him. The fear of being forgotten before he was ever remembered. When Alexander was still a young man, his father was assassinated, and suddenly the weight of an entire kingdom dropped onto his shoulders. Many believed Macedon would collapse under the rule of a young, emotional, untested King. Alexander heard the whispers. He saw the doubt in the eyes of generals, allies, and enemies alike. Instead of slowing down, he moved faster. Instead of asking for loyalty, he demanded it. Instead of showing uncertainty, he displayed brutality. Cities that rebelled were destroyed, not because Alexander enjoyed violence, but because fear told him that kindness would be interpreted as weakness. Every early decision he made was driven by the same inner voice that warned him, never let them see you hesitate, never let them see you doubt, never let them see you afraid. This fear became fuel. It sharpened his instincts, hardened his emotions, and pushed him toward relentless action. Alexander did not conquer to expand borders. He conquered to silence fear. Each victory was proof that he was not the fragile boy shaped by expectations, but a force the world had to respect. Yet the more land he took, the more fear demanded from him, because fear is never satisfied. It only grows stronger when fed. Alexander crossed into Asia Minor, facing the Persian Empire, the largest and most powerful force of the time. Many would have waited, prepared, or negotiated. Alexander did not. He attacked, not because it was the safest option, but because fear told him delay would give doubt time to grow. In battles like Granicus and Issus, Alexander led from the front, placing himself directly in danger. This was not pure bravery, it was strategic fear. He understood that if he survived, he would look invincible, and if he died, he would become immortal in memory. Either outcome was better than being seen as cautious. As Alexander defeated Darius and shattered Persian dominance, the world began to change how it looked at him. He was no longer just a king. He was a symbol of unstoppable momentum. But symbols are prisoners of expectation. They are not allowed to rest. They are not allowed to fail. Alexander felt this pressure every day. He could not stop conquering, because stopping would invite questions. Questions would invite doubt, and doubt would expose the fear he spent his life hiding. In Egypt, Alexander was declared a god, a moment that should have fulfilled him, but instead trapped him deeper. If he was a god, he could not be human. If he was divine, he could not show weakness. This pushed Alexander further away from his true self and closer to an image he felt forced to maintain. He adopted Persian customs, demanded ritual respect, and punished those who questioned his authority. not because he believed himself superior, but because fear told him that if people stopped believing in his greatness, the empire would crack. Alexander surrounded himself with loyal companions, yet even among them, he felt isolated. Fear made him suspicious. Loyalty became something to test rather than trust. Those closest to him were pushed away emotionally, because Alexander believed that attachment created vulnerability, and vulnerability created loss. He watched his own men carefully, always aware that admiration could turn into ambition, ambition into betrayal. This fear was not imaginary. Alexander had seen it happen to other rulers, and he refused to be another lesson in history. As the army marched deeper into unknown lands, Alexander pushed them beyond exhaustion. He ignored their fatigue, their homesickness, and their pleas, because fear told him that if he stopped, they would see limits, and limits would reduce him to an ordinary man. His body suffered wounds, illness, and pain, but he treated his body like a tool, not a home. Pain was acceptable because pain proved he was still moving. Fear did not allow him to slow down. During every quiet night, fear whispered that one mistake could undo everything, that enemies were waiting, that history was watching, and that the world only remembers winners. Alexander lived under constant mental siege. He could not enjoy peace because peace felt like vulnerability. He could not enjoy success because success raised expectations. He could not enjoy loyalty because loyalty could change. Fear shaped his leadership, his ambition, and his identity. He became great because fear pushed him beyond normal limits. But he also became trapped by the image fear forced him to protect. Alexander the Great was never free, because freedom would require honesty, and honesty would reveal fear. This is where the legend begins to crack, because greatness, built only on conquest, leaves no room for inner peace. And this silent war inside Alexander would only grow more intense as his journey continued into the most dangerous territory of all. Not foreign lands, but the limits of his own control. As Alexander moved forward, the world began to bend under his footsteps. But inside his mind, the pressure became heavier than any armor. He had conquered cities, crushed empires, and rewritten maps. Yet fear remained his closest companion. It no longer screamed. It whispered quietly, reminding him that the higher he stood, the more visible his fall would be. This fear followed him into India, a land unknown to Macedonian soldiers, filled with unfamiliar terrain, weather, and resistance. Alexander pushed forward, not because his army was ready, but because his fear was. Not fear told him that turning back would look like weakness, and weakness would destroy the image he had built for years. His soldiers grew exhausted, confused, and distant. They had followed him across continents, believing in glory and reward. But now they saw a man chasing something they could not understand. Alexander ignored the signs, because acknowledging their limits would force him to acknowledge his own. At the Hyphasis River, his army finally refused to march further. For the first time, Alexander faced resistance he could not kill, intimidate, or inspire away. This moment struck him harder than any blade, because it confirmed the fear he had spent his life running from, that his power had limits, that his will was not absolute, that he was still human. Alexander agreed to turn back, but internally, something broke. The unstoppable image cracked, and fear flooded the space where confidence once lived. From that moment, Alexander was no longer chasing new lands, he was running from the truth. He returned west, celebrated as a conqueror, yet mentally isolated. He began drinking heavily, not for pleasure, but for silence. Alcohol became a way to quiet the thoughts he could not control. The pressure of being Alexander the Great became unbearable, because the man behind the title was exhausted, wounded, and lost. His closest companion Hephaestion was one of the few people who saw him as a man, not a myth. When Hephaestion died suddenly, Alexander collapsed emotionally. His grief was extreme, violent, and public, because Hephaestion's death represented more than loss. It represented exposure. Without him, Alexander felt alone in a world that demanded perfection. Fear of abandonment, fear of mortality, and fear of insignificance merged into one overwhelming weight. He punished cities, executed officials, and demanded divine honors, not because he had become cool, but because fear told him that authority was the only thing holding his world together. As his health declined, Alexander ignored warnings, fevers, and pain, because stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant facing fear without armor. He began planning new campaigns into Arabia, not out of strategic need, but psychological escape. Movement had always been his defense against self-reflection. If he kept marching, he would not have to look inward. His empire stretched from Greece to India, yet he had no peace, no rest, and no clarity. The question of succession haunted him, but he refused to answer it. Choosing an heir would mean accepting death, and fear would not allow that. Alexander believed his destiny was unfinished, and unfinished destinies do not die. In Babylon, his body finally failed him. Struck by severe illness, Alexander was confined to his bed, unable to speak, command, or fight. Generals gathered around him, waiting not to help, but to position themselves for what came next. In his final days, Alexander faced the one enemy he could never defeat: stillness. He could no longer run, and fear stood directly in front of him. He knew his empire would fracture. He knew his name would be used by men who did not understand his struggle. And he knew history would remember the conqueror, not the boy shaped by expectation. When asked who should inherit his empire, Alexander answered, "To the strongest." This was not a wise political move. It was a fearful one. Choosing no one felt safer than choosing wrong. Alexander died at 32, an age when most men are still searching for direction. His empire collapsed soon after, but his legend survived for centuries. Alexander the Great became a symbol of ambition, dominance, and glory, but history rarely speaks about the cost. The fear he never showed teaches a lesson greater than conquest. Fear can drive you to greatness, but if you never confront it honestly, it will also rob you of peace. Alexander conquered the world, but never conquered the fear of being ordinary, forgotten, or vulnerable. Life proves that strength without self-awareness creates endless struggle, and success without inner peace becomes a beautiful prison. The real battle was never against armies or empires. It was against the silent fear inside him. And that is the fear he never showed to the world.